Welcome to this deep dive into Tah Tien,
Okay.
a 1973 Thai monster movie that's would be a bit of a cult classic.
Wow.
Yeah, we're going to explore a stack of reviews, online film databases, and blog posts all to uncover what makes this film so unique. Think giant smoke-loving frogs,
What?
dueling temple statues,
Yeah.
and special effects that are so bad they're good.
What's fascinating about this film is how it takes those familiar monster movie tropes and filters them through a distinctly Thai lens. It's not just about giant creatures wreaking havoc. It's a window into Thai folklore, beliefs, and even filmmaking traditions.
So is Tah Tien a legitimate member of the Kaiju Club? Or is this something entirely different?
Yeah.
That's what we're here to figure out. To start, let's set the stage with the plot. And believe me, this is where things get a little wild.
It's definitely not your typical monster movie narrative.
It revolves around Chaba,
Yeah.
a giant toad who can transform into a beautiful woman. Oh, and she enjoys a giant cigarette. Then there's Narent, the young zoologist, who falls head over heels for Chaba. Unconventional beauty standards and all. And, of course, you can't forget the epic battle between Jaeng
Wow.
and Fo, two colossal temple guardian statues that come to life and wreak havoc.
What's interesting is that those statues actually exist. At Buddhist temples in Bangkok, this is where the film starts to weave in elements of Thai folklore, drawing on the legend of how the Tah Tien area got its name.
Tatian meaning flat port.
Exactly. The legend says that those giant statues, Jaeng and Fo, got into a massive fight that literally flattened the riverbank, giving the area its name. The filmmakers are cleverly grounding this fantastical story in real-world locations and familiar cultural touchstones.
Like they're saying, hey, this could have really happened. Just look at those giant statues. Okay, let's talk about the special effects. We have men in rubber suits, some more convincing than others.
Okay.
Puppets, stock footage of animals that were clearly shot in a zoo. It's a glorious low-budget spectacle.
And yet, those cheap effects are part of the film's charm. It's that DIY aesthetic, the triumph of creativity over limitations, that makes it so endearing you can almost see the sweat and ingenuity behind those wobbly monster costumes and hastily constructed miniature buildings.
For example, to create the illusion of these giant monsters stomping on buildings, they use a technique called forced perspective. Basically, they film the monster feet at a close distance and then place tiny miniature buildings much further away. It's a classic trick used in low-budget filmmaking to make things appear larger than they are.
It's a reminder that you don't need $1 million budget. To create a memorable cinematic experience, sometimes those imperfections and limitations can actually enhance the entertainment value.
And speaking of entertainment, this film is a goldmine of unintentional comedy. You have the iconic image of the giant frog casually smoking.
Oh, yeah.
Massive cigarette. I mean, who came up with that?
It's hard to say whether that was a deliberate comedic choice or simply a product of the film's anything-goes approach to storytelling. But it's one of those scenes that gets burned into your memory.
And then there's that completely random scene of naked women swimming in a river, which is suddenly interrupted by, wait for it, a gorilla.
Oh my gosh.
It's so out of left field, you can't help but laugh.
And the way it's all shot, with those long, awkward establishing shots and the shaky camera work, it just adds to the overall sense of surreal humor.
It's like they embraced the absurdity and said, let's just throw everything at the wall and see what sticks.
Speaking of throwing things together, the film's director, Sompote Sangs, also known as Sompote Sands, was a huge fan of classic Japanese kaiju films from the 1960s.
He was particularly inspired by films from Toho and Tsuburaya Productions, specifically mentioning Daimajin, 1966, as an influence. So we see this clear lineage from the giants of Japanese cinema to the giants of Tah Tien. But it's fascinating how Sangs takes those influences and blends them with elements of Thai folklore, like those temple guardian statues and the legend of Tah Tien's naming.
He's creating a hybrid monster, a fusion of cultures and influences, just like the character of Chaba herself. She's a giant toad, but she can also transform into a beautiful woman. She's both monstrous and luring, destructive and comedic.
Which brings us back to our initial question. Is Tah Tien a legitimate member of the Kaiju Club or something else entirely? Let's dive deeper into the cultural influences and see if we can find some answers.
I'm eager to explore that aspect further. You mentioned that Tah Tien draws inspiration from a couple of specific Thai folktales.
Right.
Let's unpack how those stories connect to the film's themes.
Okay, so the first one is called Utai Tawi. You ever heard of it?
It's not as widely known outside of Thailand, but it's a classic love story, a tale of overcoming differences and finding love in unexpected places.
It centers around a frog princess and a snake prince, who are destined to be together, even though they seem like a pretty mismatched pair. Utaitawi is all about love transcending boundaries, which I think we can see mirrored in Tah Tien, with the relationship between Chaba and Narend.
That's a great observation. While Tatian doesn't go into the full plot of Utaitawi, it definitely borrows that central theme of accepting someone for who they are, regardless of their appearance or, in Chaba's case, their species.
Right. It's like the filmmakers are using this familiar folktale element as a foundation
Yeah.
for the more fantastical and, let's face it, ridiculous parts of Tah Tien.
It's a clever way to ground the film in Thai culture and make it resonate with local audiences. It's like they're saying, hey, this crazy story isn't so far-fetched. We've got talking animals and shape-shifting creatures in our own traditional tales.
Exactly. And it adds a layer of depth to what might otherwise seem like a silly monster movie. The second folktale, as we mentioned earlier, is the one about those two giant temple guards, Yakwat Jaeng and Yakwat Fo, and how their epic battle flattened the riverbank. But there's actually more to it than that.
The visual representation of those giants is quite significant. Yakwat Jaeng, the green demon, is designed as a traditional Thai demon figure, while Yakwat Fo is depicted as an armored Chinese warrior.
I hadn't even thought about that. So it's not just a random monster mashup.
Right. This visual distinction hints at a clash of cultures, or even a subtle commentary on Thailand's history of interactions with its neighbors.
That's fascinating. It's like the film is subtly referencing those historical tensions through the visual language of its monsters.
Exactly. It adds a layer of complexity that you might not expect from a film that also features a giant frog smoking a cigarette.
Speaking of Chaba, how does she fit into this cultural puzzle? She's a giant toad, which in many cultures would be seen as a negative symbol. But in Thai folklore, frogs are often associated with good luck and prosperity.
That's an important point. In Thailand, frogs are linked to water, which is essential for life. And they're often seen as bringers of good fortune. So Chaba's character is more nuanced than just a typical monstrous creature.
And then there's her ability to transform into a beautiful woman.
That's a classic motif found in myths and stories worldwide. It taps into this universal theme of metamorphosis and transformation, which is also prevalent in Thai folklore.
So Chaba embodies both the monstrous and the beautiful, the powerful and the benevolent. It's a pretty complex portrayal for a character in a movie that, let's be honest, doesn't take itself too seriously.
That's precisely what makes Tatian so compelling. It's this delightful blend of high and low culture, ancient myths, and modern filmmaking techniques, all wrapped up in this wonderfully absurd package.
It's like a cinematic version of pad thai, as I said earlier. A little bit sweet, a little bit sour, a little bit spicy, and utterly unique to Thai culture.
Exactly, and it highlights how important it is to consider the cultural context. When analyzing a film like Tah Tien, we can't just look at it through the lens of Western monster movie conventions. We need to understand the cultural influences that shaped its creation.
So we've got these folktale influences, the connections to real-life landmarks, the symbolic representations of the monsters. All of this adds a level of depth and richness that might not be immediately apparent. Now, I'm curious, how does Tah Tien compare to those classic Japanese kaiju films that inspired its director? Does it manage to carve out its own unique space within that genre?
That's where things get even more intriguing. While Tatian draws inspiration from those classic Toho and Subaraya Productions films, it doesn't just mimic them. You'll find it brings something fresh to the table. A Thai perspective on the giant monster genre that blends in folklore, comedy, and even a touch of romance.
Yeah, it's not your typical Godzilla-style, city-smashing gloom and doom monster flick. There's a playfulness to it. That sets it apart.
Chaba's portrayal really illustrates that. Think about your typical kaiju film. The monster is this force of nature, often destructive or carrying some heavy symbolism. But Chaba, she's more like a mischievous trickster figure who uses her powers for both good and, well, mostly chaotic fun.
It's like she's the Loki of the monster world. Never a dull moment. You never know what she'll do next, but you can bet it'll be entertaining. And let's be real, you wouldn't see a giant frog chilling in a rocking chair, puffing away on a cigarette the size of a small car in your average Godzilla movie.
Precisely. That scene perfectly captures Tatian's willingness to embrace the absurd. It's a self-aware monster movie winking at the audience and reveling in its own silliness.
And the special effects, while charming in their own right, also play into that subversion of expectations. We're so used to seeing high-budget CGI monsters these days.
Right.
In comparison, Tatian's men in suits approach feels almost refreshing. in its honesty.
There's that DIY aesthetic to it that's endearing. You can practically see the sweat and an ingenuity poured into those wobbly monster costumes and those hastily constructed miniature buildings.
It's like the filmmakers were saying, we may not have $1 million budget, but we're going to make the most of what we've got and have a blast doing it. It's that underdog spirit that resonates.
And that energy is infectious. It makes you want to cheer for the film, even when the monster is, quite obviously, being pushed around by a couple of stagehands.
Yeah.
Or that stock footage of a rhinoceros looks completely out of place.
But even with all its quirkiness, Tatian still delivers on those core kaiju elements. The giant monsters, the epic battles, and a healthy dose of city destruction.
True, but even the destruction feels different in Tah Tien. It's more cartoonish, less apocalyptic. You get the sense that even with all the mayhem, things will work out in the end. It's almost like a monster movie for people who don't typically love monster movies.
Exactly. Which might explain its lasting appeal.
Ah.
It's accessible and entertaining to a much wider audience.
And let's not forget the recurring character of Jaeng. He pops up again in Sompote Sands' later films like Jumborg Ace and Giant. Even teams up with a Japanese tokusatsu hero, which is a whole other genre of special effects-heavy live-action entertainment, popular in Japan. You see this green demon again in Magic Lizard almost a decade later.
It seems like Sompote Sands had a real soft spot for this creation. It speaks volumes about the director's personal style and his desire to create his own unique monster mythology within Thai cinema.
Absolutely. It goes beyond just paying homage to the kaiju genre. He's actively building on it, adding to that legacy, with his own distinct flavor.
So to circle back to our original question, is Tah Tien a full-fledged member of the Kaiju Club, or is it something else entirely?
It's both, really. It takes the DNA of the kaiju film and splices it with Thai folklore, low-budget ingenuity, and a playful sense of humor. Tah Tien is a hybrid monster in itself, much like Java.
We've uncovered the folktale influences woven throughout the film, those clever connections to real-life locations in Bangkok, and the symbolic layers embedded in the monster's designs. It all adds up to something much richer than just a silly monster movie.
Tatian encourages us to look beyond the surface, to find joy in the unexpected, and to appreciate how different cultures reinterpret universal themes, like good versus evil and love conquering all. It's a testament to the power of storytelling, even when presented in an unconventional, imperfect package.
If you're looking for a monster movie that's a little different, a little weirder, a little more lighthearted, I highly recommend seeking out Tatian. You might just discover your new favorite cult classic. And hey, who knows, there might be even more to uncover than what we found in our sources.
Happy viewing.